Lecture 14, Varieties of Jewish Thought and Practice.
Many religious traditions have a sacred center, a place that is holier than any other, and that exists not only as an important pilgrimage site, but also as a powerful force in the religious consciousness of all believers. As we've seen, Varanasi functions this way for Hindus, and we'll see how Mecca occupies this status for Muslims. So what is the sacred center for Jews? I believe that there are two ways to answer this question, and this will illustrate the two very different forms that the religion has taken since the Israelites reached the Promised Land, according to tradition, over 3,000 years ago. The first sacred center is undoubtedly Jerusalem, which was established as the capital of the Kingdom of Israel by Israel's greatest king, David. According to tradition, the Kingdom of Israel existed as a united monarchy from around 1020 BCE to 930 BCE, during which it was ruled primarily by three kings, Saul, David, and Solomon. It's under the reign of King Solomon that the Great Temple is built in Jerusalem as a home for the Ark of the Covenant, and also as a place to make sacrifices to God. The Israelites, who had been wanderers for so long, now have a place of worship, a place where God's presence could be felt most powerfully. After Solomon's death, the northern tribes rebel and establish a kingdom of Israel in the north, while the southern kingdom of Judah, which retained Jerusalem, remains loyal to David's line. The northern kingdom of Israel is conquered by Assyria in 722 BCE, and most of the Israelites are exiled and dispersed, becoming known as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. The kingdom of Judah, however, remains independent for over a century more, until it's finally conquered by the Babylonians in 586 BCE, leading to the destruction of the temple. Many of the Judeans, or Jews, as those from Judea can be called, are exiled in Babylon. Yet another example of an exile and eventual return in the history of the people. After being in exile in Babylon for 50 years, some Jews returned to their Holy Land, permitted to do so by King Cyrus of Persia, who had conquered the Babylonians. Although most Jews did not return to Jerusalem, the rebuilt temple, the Second Temple, became a sacred center and important symbol to Jews wherever they lived. However, the religion that these Jews practiced bears little resemblance to the Judaism practiced today. So we'll now discuss the transition from the religion of the Second Temple, which featured a priestly class and animal sacrifices to God, to the religion of the rabbis and Torah that characterizes Judaism today. And to that, we now turn. In the 4th century BCE, the empire of Alexander the Great brought Greek influences to the Middle East, and many Jews began to adopt Greek ways. Tensions between traditional and Hellenized or Greek-influenced Jews increased. And these divisions within the Jewish community were dramatically compounded when the Hellenistic Syrian ruler, Antiochus IV, who had authority over Israel during this time, attempted to impose Hellenistic culture on all of Israel. He mandated the worship of Greek gods, forbade the reading of and obedience to the Torah, and banned circumcision. In an act powerful for its symbolism, he put an altar to the Greek god Zeus in the temple in Jerusalem, and he sacrificed a hog, an animal considered unclean in Jewish law, in the temple. This led to a rebellion of the Jewish people, led by the Maccabee family, against the Syrians. This triumphant war, which resulted in the establishment of an independent kingdom of Israel, is commemorated every year through the celebration of Hanukkah, which we'll discuss at greater length in the next lecture. This kingdom lasted for less than a century until its conquest by Rome, and it was the last Jewish nation until the establishment of the State of Israel nearly 2,000 years later. So, what was the religion of the Jewish people like during the Second Temple period? Well, first, it centered on the holy site of the temple, in which priests performed sacrifices of animals, grains, and holy oil. In addition, there were groups that separated themselves from society. The Essenes were a group that focused on piety and maintained purity through retreat from corrupt society, communal ownership of property, asceticism, and a commitment to righteous living. And some Essenes retreated to a compound near the Dead Sea called Qumran, where their library of texts, known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, was discovered in 1947. These include some of the oldest surviving copies of biblical texts. At the same time, however, another form of Judaism began to emerge. Jewish religious life began to flourish in places outside of the temple, namely synagogues, houses of prayer, where people could meet to read the Torah and pray together. The organization of the Hebrew Bible was finalized, and the tradition of reading weekly Torah portions probably began. While the religion of sacrifices in the temple were controlled by priests, it was the sages, scholars, and scribes, people who would become known as rabbis, or my master, who were authorities in the realm of Torah study and interpretation. Another group of Jews that was important toward the end of this period is the Zealots, who advocated armed resistance to Roman rule. Roman civil religion required the worship of emperors, which was forbidden under Jewish monotheism, and taxation also produced discontent. This all came to a head in the Great Jewish Revolt, which began in the year 66 CE, which culminated in the slaughter of Jewish rebels and the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70. If you've been to a Jewish wedding, you no doubt remember the dramatic part toward the end of the ceremony where the groom smashes a glass. There are many interpretations of this practice, but one of them is that even during a joyous event like a wedding, Jews must remember the painful event of the destruction of the temple. The only part of the temple that survived was a set of foundation stones used in a retaining wall. This one surviving fragment of the temple, known as the Western Wall, is the holiest pilgrimage site to Jews in the world, along with the Temple Mount itself. Many Jews who come to the wall weep in mourning over the destruction of the temple, which has given the site the name the Wailing Wall. In addition to praying at the wall, many Jews put written prayers on slips of paper into cracks in the wall. From this point until the 20th century, the vast majority of the world's Jews lived in the diaspora, a condition of scattering and dispersion around the world. Even today, over half the world's Jews live outside of Israel. During the 2 millennia that the Jews did not live in their Holy Land and without their temple, what held the community together? I began this lecture by saying that there are 2 sacred centers for Jews, and the first one's Jerusalem, the temple in particular. Throughout the many centuries of exile, Jews still kept Jerusalem in their hearts and minds, and wherever they lived, they'd maintained the aspiration to one day return to their promised land. Psalm 137 contains the powerful lament of the Jews who during the Babylonian exile declared, "If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither." Every year, at the end of the Passover meal, Jews proclaim, "Lashana haba'ah b'Yerushalayim," next year in Jerusalem. Nevertheless, once the temple was lost and the people dispersed, the Jews had to find a new center. And they found it not in a building or a city, not in a place at all. The new center was the text, the Torah, which became the foundation for the traditions, laws, and rituals that held the community together throughout the diaspora. After the destruction of the temple, the authority of the priests and the practice of animal sacrifices were replaced by the authority of rabbis and the practices of prayer, Torah reading, study, and ethical behavior. And these have remained essential to Judaism ever since. Rabbis were heads of the Jewish community, leaders of liturgical prayer and rituals, scholars and teachers, and experts in jurisprudence. People gathered in synagogues, houses of assembly, to read from the Torah, pray, and sing, although such places were not required for communal worship. The rabbis engaged in a process of interpretation called midrash, which involves probing the deep meaning of biblical texts, filling in the gaps of stories in the Bible, and looking at subtexts and implications of passages. There are two areas of Judaism that are the focus of debate and interpretation: halakha, covering the areas of law and custom, and agadah, all the non-legalistic aspects of the tradition, including narratives, history, folklore, and moral and practical advice. The commandments and laws of Judaism bound Jewish communities together during the diaspora and marked the Jewish communities as distinct from the other communities around them. As the rabbis continued to engage and discuss matters of law, ritual, ethics, and other aspects of life, their discourses were eventually written down and brought together in the Mishnah around 200 CE. Later rabbis' analysis and commentaries were ultimately organized and combined with the Mishnah to make the Talmud. The Talmud is fundamentally important in Rabbinic Judaism. The Torah is not read or interpreted in isolation in Rabbinic Judaism. The Talmud is essential for understanding the Torah and applying it to one's life. For example, think about the biblical prohibition of work on the Sabbath. The Bible says that on the seventh day, thou shalt not do any manner of work. What exactly constitutes work? Can you cook, read, walk? When can exceptions be made? And for that matter, when does the Sabbath actually begin and end precisely? This is where you consult the Talmud, which has a section on 39 categories of activities that are prohibited on the Sabbath, along with the discussion of precise methods for determining the beginning and end of the Sabbath. In the Talmud, you'll find a passage of the Torah surrounded by comments and interpretations from rabbis, which themselves are then subject to further interpretations and discussion. In other words, the Talmud presents an ongoing conversation and debate across space and time among rabbis in its pages. And the process continues among rabbis today. Discussion and debate have been central features of the Jewish tradition. One of the principal ways that students learn in a yeshiva, a Jewish religious school, is to be put together in pairs where the two students converse and argue. In an interview, Jewish writer and philosopher Elie Wiesel was asked, "Christians express beauty through sculpture and painting, Muslims through calligraphy and architecture. How do Jews express beauty?" Without hesitating, he replied, "With words." From the time of the fall of the Second Temple, Jews have lived in almost every part of the world. And in most of the places they lived, they constituted a separate community that tried to prohibit marriage with non-Jews, follow their own authorities and laws, and preserve their way of life and traditions while in exile. This is how Jews managed to avoid being assimilated into the dominant cultures where they lived, and how they survived as a people and maintained their culture in the centuries of the diaspora. The treatment of Jews varied dramatically in different places at different times. In some cases, they were largely left alone to maintain their way of life. At times, such as the later Middle Ages in Poland, Jews were able to flourish in many ways. In this case, Poland's leaders encouraged Jewish immigration to promote economic development. Enjoying freedom in matters of work and residence, the Jewish population grew and thrived, making Poland a center for Jewish life and thought in the world. The Jews of Central and Eastern Europe are known as Ashkenazi Jews. Ashkenazi is a Hebrew word for a region in Germany where the group of Jews originated. Between the 11th and 19th centuries, Jews from this region migrated to areas further east, including Hungary, Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, and Russia. The Ashkenazi Jews developed the language of Yiddish, which was a hybrid of German and Hebrew written with the Hebrew alphabet. Yiddish culture has made many contributions to Western society, drawing from its rich storytelling tradition and distinctive styles of humor, which has led to a long tradition of well-known Jewish comedians such as Henny Youngman, Mel Brooks, Woody Allen, and Jerry Seinfeld. And of course, we have Ashkenazi Jews to thank for such words as schmutz, chutzpah, kvetch, and schlep. The majority of Jews in the world today, including Israel, and a significant majority of American Jews, are Ashkenazi. Jews flourished in other areas as well during certain historical periods, with one notable example being Islamic Spain. It's worth noting, especially in light of the tragic history of Jewish-Muslim relations since the 20th century began, that throughout the Middle Ages, Jews usually fared relatively better under Islamic rule than they did under Christian rule. As we'll see when we discuss Islam, during the 10th and 11th centuries, the height of civilization was found primarily in great Muslim cities like Baghdad and Cordoba. In Muslim Spain, Jews could rise to high positions in politics, medicine, philosophy, and literature. Jews who lived in Spain and Portugal and their descendants are known as Sephardi Jews, Sephardi basically meaning Spanish. In addition to their different points of origins, Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews differ in other respects as well. Differences in matters of ritual, food, and pronunciation of Hebrew, for example. There were many influential Jewish thinkers during the Middle Ages, but perhaps none is considered as great as Moses ben Maimon, called Maimonides, and known by many Jews as Rambam, for the acronym Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. He was born in Cordoba, Spain in 1135 and died in Egypt in 1204. A prolific author, Maimonides was a rabbi, philosopher, legal scholar, physician, in fact a court physician to powerful rulers, and a leader of the Jewish community. His 14-volume Mishnah Torah, a codification of Jewish law and ethics, is considered to be a standard of comprehensive scholarship, still studied in yeshivas today. The mystical, esoteric expression of Judaism is generally referred to as Kabbalah, which found systematic expression first in the 11th through 13th centuries and developed different forms later on. The most important mystical text is the Zohar, the first appearance of which occurred in 13th century Spain, although its origins are traditionally said to date back centuries earlier. Despite the fact that European Jews did well and made many contributions in certain times and places, their overall story is, of course, profoundly painful and tragic. A pattern that repeats itself countless times throughout the 2 millennia of the diaspora is one where Jews were oppressed, ghettoized, expelled, and all too often violently attacked. Even in places where they once thrived, like Poland and Spain, Jews eventually fell victim to changing historical and political currents. In Poland, ruthless campaigns were conducted against Jews in the 15th century, and starting in 1648, over 100,000 Jews were killed in Poland and the Ukraine when they were targeted during wars and uprisings. In late 15th century Spain, after Christian rulers replaced Muslims, Jews were forcibly expelled from the country in which they lived for more than a millennium. Anti-Semitism was pervasive throughout Europe in the Middle Ages and into the modern period, and Jews were exiled from many countries. Jews were expelled from both England and France in the 13th century, for example. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries in Russia, many Jewish communities were victims of violent mob attacks known as pogroms, which aimed to assault and kill Jews and destroy their businesses and synagogues. These are just some of the examples, and they're important to understand as precursors to the most horrifying manifestation of anti-Semitism, the attempted genocide of the Jewish people in the Holocaust during World War II. This systematic, state-sponsored campaign of murder against the Jewish people resulted in the deaths of over half of the entire Jewish population of Europe, about 6 million people. That's over a third of all Jews in the world. In Hebrew, this is known as the Shoah, or catastrophe. Yom HaShoah is a date to commemorate the Jews and others who died in the Holocaust. It's held on the 27th day of the month of Nisan in the Jewish calendar, which falls in April or May. At sundown in Israel, the Israeli flag is lowered to half-mast, and 6 torches are lit to represent the 6 million Jews who perished. There's no public entertainment. Instead, speeches and documentaries reflect on the event, and a siren is sounded throughout the country at 10 a.m., during which the people stop to silently remember the dead. It's impossible to overstate the significance of the Holocaust in the consciousness of Jews. In Jewish thought, theologians had a struggle with their understandings of God, the problem of evil, and the nature of the covenant in light of their suffering. Jewish thought was haunted by the question, how can we continue to have faith after the Holocaust? While some Jewish theologians brought currents of anger and protest against God into their theologies, and others came to understand God as lacking omnipotence, most thinkers argued for a sustained faith in God and for a commitment to justice and compassion to ensure that such a tragedy will never happen again. A powerful voice for this reaffirmed faith is Emil Fackenheim, who argued that the Jewish people must not let the actions of Hitler drive them from their faith. He wrote, "Jews are forbidden to hand Hitler posthumous victories. They are commanded to survive as Jews, lest the Jewish people perish. They are commanded to remember the victims of Auschwitz, lest their memory perish. They are forbidden to despair of the God of Israel, lest Judaism perish." The intensity of the Jewish commitment to never forget and to take all steps necessary to ensure their security and freedom contributed strongly to the Zionist movement and the creation of the modern state of Israel. Zionism is the Jewish movement that sought to establish a Jewish homeland in the biblical land of Israel. As we've already seen, there was always a sense among diaspora Jews that they were yearning to return to Israel, expressed each year in the cry of "Next year in Jerusalem." So with increasing anti-Semitism in Europe, these calls intensified. And in the late 19th century, Zionism grew into an organized political movement led by Theodor Herzl, an Austrian journalist. Groups of Jews began to return to build settlements with a commitment to building a new nation. As an important part of this process, the language of Hebrew was revived in the 19th and 20th centuries as a language to be shared by returning Jews who spoke a wide variety of languages in the diaspora, such as Yiddish, as we've seen. This is the only known example from history of a language with no native speakers being consciously revived to become the native language of millions. Hebrew had been considered the sacred language of the Jews, in which they prayed and read the Torah, but it was turned into a modern national language during this period. Many Zionists were secular Jews, motivated not by any particular theological commitments, but by the belief that Jews would never be fully secure until they had their own nation. In fact, some Orthodox Jews initially opposed Zionism, believing that only God could end their exile and restore the temple. Ultimately, the modern state of Israel was founded in 1948 as a homeland for Jews. The origins of the Arab-Israeli conflict, which has led to so much hostility between Arabs and Jews, who, as we know, often coexisted peacefully in many periods of the diaspora, has its origins here. Before we can get to the details of how Jews practice, we have to first ask another key question. Which Jews? There are many different forms of Judaism, and the details of how Judaism is lived differ, in some respects, for each individual Jew. However, most Jews, other than completely secular Jews, who consider their Jewishness purely ethnic, fall into one of three groups: Orthodox, Conservative, or Reform. Orthodoxy is the form of Judaism that emphasizes closely following the revealed law contained in the Torah and Talmud as interpreted by the rabbis. Orthodox Jews have differed profoundly over conceptions of God, the role of reason, or the legitimacy of Zionism, but they all agree on certain essential matters of law and ritual, although they'll debate over the details. Among the many divisions within Orthodoxy, we'll focus on two. One form of Orthodox Judaism is Hasidism, which developed in 18th century Eastern Europe. The movement was founded by Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, born in 1698, who was known as the master of the good name, Baal Shem Tov. He was seen to be a man not only of great knowledge, but spiritual power and charisma. And this was the beginning of the tradition of the tzaddik, or Rebbe, in Hasidism, a charismatic figure with wisdom, authority, and spiritual attainment who was qualified to transmit a form of transformative mystical knowledge. Hasidic Jews place a great emphasis on emotion and celebration, finding joy in the relationship with God and expressing it through singing and dancing. They find holiness in day-to-day life, and they highlight the sacredness of the ordinary. When Hasidic Jews pray, they do so with deep concentration, often swaying back and forth as they chant in total immersion. Hasidic men usually wear dark clothing, often involving a long jacket and black hat. Following a biblical passage forbidding the shaving of the side of one's face, Hasidic men often have long, uncut sideburns and beards. Some forms of Hasidism have a strongly messianic element, emphasizing the role that prayer and good works can play in bringing about the Messiah's coming. While some Orthodox Jews, such as those called ultra-Orthodox, are more insular and commit themselves to a life of intensive religious study, the modern Orthodox seek to combine observance of the law with a fuller integration into the modern world. Like other Orthodox Jews, the modern Orthodox are fully committed to living out the will of God as expressed in the Torah and Talmud, but they also embrace secular education, a very wide array of professions, as long as the job is in accord with Jewish ethics and law, modern forms of dress, and somewhat greater gender equality. Some yeshivas are open to women, although there are no female Orthodox rabbis. The origins of conservative and Reform Judaism are found in the Enlightenment, a period in the 18th century that was characterized by a commitment to the authority of reason, along with notions of individualism, autonomy, equality, and rights. In some countries, such as post-revolution France, Jews began to gain rights, including citizenship. And Jews in many countries, especially Germany, began to develop forms of Judaism based on Enlightenment values that aimed to integrate Jews more fully into European society and culture. There were movements to change the liturgy so that some hymns and prayers and sermons were delivered in the common spoken language, the vernacular, instead of Hebrew, and to shift the focus away from a return to Israel and rebuilding of the temple and toward the notion that they could live as faithful Jews and good citizens of the countries in which they lived. In other words, their condition would no longer be seen as being in exile, but rather at home. Reform Judaism grew out of this 18th century Enlightenment movement, and it led to services that featured vernacular language and choirs, sometimes organs, men and women seated together, and a downplaying of the aspiration to return to Israel and restore the temple. But most importantly, it said that the essence of Judaism did not lie in adherence to following Jewish law. The laws of the Torah would be seen as guidelines that could be adjusted to modernity, not as binding obligations that all Jews must observe. Judaism would be modernized and would focus on ethics. One of the most significant transformations came in the role of women, as Reform Judaism has had women serving as rabbis since 1972. Well, the first woman rabbi, the only one before 1972, was ordained in Germany in 1935. She died tragically in the Holocaust. Reform Judaism has also embraced gays and lesbians, and gay rabbis have been ordained. Most Reform Jews do not keep kosher, do not strictly observe the Sabbath, and do not attend synagogue weekly. However, many Reform Jews do attend synagogue periodically, especially during the High Holy Days, and still practice important rituals and traditions, such as the lighting of candles on the Sabbath, or holding a Passover Seder, celebrating the bar and bat mitzvahs of sons and daughters, and observing holidays such as Hanukkah and Purim. Of American Jews who are affiliated with a synagogue, the highest percentage is Reform, followed by conservative and then Orthodox. Conservative Judaism was also shaped by Enlightenment values, but it resisted some of the more liberal positions taken up by the Reform movement. While the very term Reform emphasizes the move to change Judaism, the word conservative demonstrates the commitment to conserve the essence of Jewish tradition. It's also been called traditional Judaism. Conservatives affirm the authority of Jewish law, but argue that its interpretation and application have always changed throughout history. While conservatives do not adhere to the law as rigorously as Orthodox Jews do, there's a tendency to believe that ethical justifications are required to override the law. The conservative movement voted in 1983 to ordain women, and they approved the ordination of gay and lesbian rabbis in 2006. We've now surveyed the story of the Jewish people from the biblical period to the present day, and we've looked at the main forms of Judaism today. In the next lecture, we'll look at how Jews live today, what rituals and holidays are practiced, what are the practices that are likely to be found in the home of an observant Jew. In answering these questions, we'll see Judaism not only as an ancient tradition that has taken many forms throughout history, but also as a living tradition that continues to give meaning to millions of Jews today.